at the time also. So I will stick.
So please.
Thank you very much. There is one thing that unites all religions and philosophies across time periods. The body is a problem. It is fragile, flawed, and fated to die. Every major belief system, including belief in modern science, has to deal with the body and its uncontrollable nature. The messages received via religion are often rife with contradictions. The human body is a wonder of creation, but it is corrupt. It is a temptation, but it is a temple. Its perfect resurrection in Christianity is a key part of the gospel. But in the meantime, imperfect bodies falter, fail, and fall ill. A sick body may be a punishment, an indication of unconfessed sin, or a test of faith. But no one ever chooses to be ill, right? Or do they? This is a question I will explore within select examples from Jerome's epistles. Jerome's references to bodily ailments in his letters can be divided roughly into three categories. The first is metaphorical. Here I refer to the common topos of weakness or sin as a disease that must be treated or excised, often by Christ, the divine physician. The second category concerns references to bodily weakness explicitly caused by asceticism. And the final group concerns human beings suffering from illness or injury, and the references are not explicitly caused by asceticism. Of course, there are other subcategories, other categories we could draw here and also talk about overlapping of these categories, but these are the basic three. The first category, metaphorical illness, is not so relevant to the scope of my paper. I want to talk about actual ailments as represented in Jerome's letters in order to determine how corporeal suffering is stylistically treated and what rhetorical purpose bodily pain serves. For this reason, my three passages for discussion are drawn from the second and third categories. But this association of illness with sin, both original sin and active transgressions, can never truly be ignored in late antiquity. It's a permanent feature in this landscape, and it's going to play a role in my final analysis, whether I like it or not. Any depiction of corporeal suffering has to be read in light of socioeconomic status. And for this reason, I'm going to start by very, very briefly outlining Jerome's self-presentation as an ascetic and his ideals for ascetic community. How did a man from a well-off family come to depict himself as living in abject poverty? Jerome's performance of poverty, and what I call maybe a theology of choice, underpinning this poverty, provides the backdrop for examining then three passages from his epistles. One pertains to ascetic illness, and then there are two passages I will discuss that pertain to the care of sick and injured people. So let's start with Jerome's background. Before this audience, it's not necessary to really go into great depth here on his biography. Jerome was a parvenu whose family had the means to provide him with elite education. Robert Castor suggests his family was wealthier than Augustine's, as the cost of tuition and living in Rome was not a concern for him, and Augustine had to rely on Romanianus. Jerome profited from relationships that he formed in his early years. His friendship with Pamachius, a senator, is a prime example of this. And after brief stints elsewhere, Jerome abandoned his dream of a lucrative career in the imperial service, instead joining a group of ascetics that counted some of his childhood friends as members. On account of the Origenist controversy, he left Aquileia for Antioch in 371 and lived in the so-called Desert of Chalcis for 9 years, again among elite company. Much of his renown and authority can be credited to the letters that he wrote during this time, in which he constructs various personae for himself: the hero, the desert ascetic, the scholar. He returned to Rome, was ordained, and eventually revised and retranslated the Latin Bible. His side project was befriending wealthy women and urging them to lead chaste lives. By donning the nimbus of an experienced desert ascetic and penning works advocating asceticism, he could shape his own authority as a spiritual teacher. Jerome's monastic asceticism enabled him to claim to be a special kind of poor, and thus in need of assistance. This is evident in the Contra Vigilantium, where he argues trenchantly against the opinion that alms should help the local church instead of being shipped off to Jerusalem. So I'm not going to read all of the text on my slides. I trust that you can read it. There's often both the Latin and English will be there, sometimes just one or the other. Jerome, however, has a horse in this particular race. Alms that would be sent to Jerusalem helped finance his monastery, as Philip Pozar has discussed earlier, and his hostel for travelers there. But how could he reasonably depict himself as deserving of alms as someone from a wealthy family? Moreover, he was supported by Paula and other rich aristocrats. He voluntarily gave up the right to have property when he became a monk. And the distinction here is that Jerome considered himself to belong to an elite community of holy poor, which are entirely separate from the common poor. According to Jerome, there are these two categories of poor people. There are the isti paupers, the common poor people, who are dominated by base sexual urges. They don't possess anything now, and they will not possess anything in eternity because of their sin. Then there are the sancti pauperes, the community of Christian ascetics, the poor in spirit. And Jerome insidiously uses the beatitude, blessed are the poor in spirit, to emphasize that poverty alone does not entitle one to membership in the holy poor. One must choose to renounce the world in order to be deserving of alms. Thus, the holy poor form a sanitized version of poor people who conform to elite social norms in almost every other way. They have noble families, they are well-mannered, they are educated, they blush at the right times, and they appreciate donations more than the actual poor who are driven by their base desires. And Jerome's argument in Contra Vigilantium is remarkably commercial. It's good to give alms to those who can give something back to you, namely your spiritual salvation. And good luck getting that from unwashed, starving masses. Jerome's construction of an elite poor that is characterized by voluntary poverty without sacrifice of social status is at odds with normal, common, poor people who don't have a choice. And additionally, it's unknown how poor these elite ascetics really were. Fabiola is a good example. She gave away her wealth and allegedly was reduced to a pauper, but nonetheless, she managed to found a hospice in Rome, a hostel for travelers at Portus. She traveled to Jerusalem, she was a guest of Jerome. She had all of this money. It's rather suspicious that she had that after she was supposedly living in poverty. And a few years later, Gerontius claimed that Melania the Younger, another incredibly rich woman, underwent this same transformation, from riches to rags, so poor she was enrolled in the matricula. But it is clear that Melania held on to a large portion of her wealth. And this had become then a trope. Aristocratic conversions have to include this renunciation of wealth and embrace of poverty. But it didn't require a complete financial destitution or a loss of social status. On the contrary, your status is enhanced and you get fame and friends when you undergo this type of conversion. And we can say maybe there's a little bit of a modern parallel in certain method actors. They're first famous for their beauty, then they willfully throw that beauty away to play a particular role. They gain weight or they lose incredible amounts of weight. This wins them more fame and culminates in a partial or complete return to their former level of beauty and fame. So, the holy poor and the vulgar poor find their counterparts in Jerome's discussion of sick bodies, where ascetic illness and vulgar illness are similarly marked. So we have a mirroring effect, I will argue. So let's talk about ascetic illness. The ascetic abasement of the body, especially the female body, was a favorite epistolary theme for Jerome. One example can be found in Jerome's defense of Blasilla's extreme asceticism as a divine lesson. So he writes this to Marcella about what Blasilla is undergoing. And the rest of the letter contrasts Blasilla's former self-indulgent life with her current regimen. But something went dreadfully wrong, and ascetics are supposed to retain their health, a reward for their faith. They're supposed to be miraculously always healthy, no matter what. But Blasilla died from her illness, and Jerome had much to answer for. He wrote a consolation for her mother, Paula, probably his dearest friend in the world. Now that the body of deceased Blasilla is actually worm food, not just soon to be devoured, he has to present an asceticized memory of her suffering, which he does here. Oh, sorry, maybe there was a... Yeah, okay, so there is one missing, but it's okay. Basically that she is pale and quivering, and she totters with weakness. So he contrasts Blasilla's holy disease with two other types of corporeal ailments, children that are already born with diseases, and Paula's fasting out of grief. But he walks a delicate line. The ascetic life is characterized by choice. This is underscored when Jerome talks about the diabolical whispering concerning Paula's excessive grief. So how long must we refrain from deriving these detestable monks out of Rome? They've misled this unhappy woman. It's clear she's not a nun by her own choice. So Jerome has to simultaneously characterize Blasilla's asceticism as a voluntary decision ordained by God, and also place it at odds with suicide. In the Consolation, he takes care to depict the deceased in a way that is reminiscent of a beautiful death. She is pale, tottering, but there's no disgusting aspect to it, no worms. In comparison, this reference to the children who are born with diseases has a certain dramatic luridness. Demonic possession is listed alongside the jaundice and leprosy, which are both normal references in literature of this sort. They're both inherited and unavoidably visible ailments that children would suffer. But they are nameless, and they exist purely as a foil for Blasilla. And the existence of sick babies is a lament, but it can't be described as a noble population who chose to suffer. And another foil is Paula's sorrowful lack of appetite. It's also a choice, but it's a bad choice. It's an indulgent choice, because the motivation for her fast is not an ascetic one. Although exhortation against grief, excessive grief, is a commonplace in Consolations, Jerome explicitly states that Paula's sadness is being exploited by the devil. So this sublimated presentation is more or less representative of Jerome's presentation of other illnesses that are caused by asceticism, but he doesn't present very many examples of this. The reality of asceticism must have been rather horrible if it actually occurred to the extremes that we believe it did. Jerome does not choose to color ascetic suffering in a dramatic fashion, but now I want to look at two passages that describe the suffering of the common people in a fully exploitative and dramatic fashion. And one is Epistle 66. This is a consolation to Pamachius on the death of his wife. And it's got a lot of praise for Pamachius, but not for his wife. And the celebration is that Pamachius has constructed a xenodopium, or a hospice, a hospital for strangers. And here we have some very disgusting images. We have dropsy that is pregnant with death, amputated feet, things like this. And this scene could have been a passionate scene, but it's instead a freakish scene of diseases and injuries. A crowd, almost monsters, at the door. And if this were not enough, Jerome uses a poetic topos, the many mouths motif, which is associated with hell and suffering. And this marks, it inserts a kind of poetic distance here, that the reader then is inclined to appreciate this catalogue of illnesses and things from a distance, as a rhetorical and narrative device, and not as something that's actually human. And maybe the worst part of it all is that Pamachius is washed white by the squalor of these people. The second example that I have is from Epistle 77, and it contains a similar description of the indigent poor. And these passages, 77 and 66, are linked not only by the content of what's going on at this hospital. Here, the hospital is called a nosocomium. It's a different word, but it's almost certainly the same place, the same thing is going on, and both words could be used for hospital. But the Virgilian topos is also here. So we have, again, the poetic distance. In this time, the injuries and sicknesses include atypical ailments that sound like mutilations or judicial punishments. We have the normal, we have sore, hands with sores, I'm sorry, I'll go to the translation. Hands covered with sores, diseased flesh alive with worm. But we have three interesting things here. We have noses slit, eyes put out, and feet that are half burned. A nose is usually slit or cut off on purpose, not accidentally. This was a punishment known to have been meted out to slaves or to adulterers. And blinding doesn't have a strong legal precedent in the Roman world, but Galen does talk about witnessing these severe punishments inflicted upon slaves, including eyes being gouged out with a pen. The half-burnt feet immediately call to mind ordeals by fire, but not just ordeals by fire, failed ones. I mean, if your feet are burned, that's automatically you didn't pass. So this cluster of injuries suggests that some of the hospital patients were slaves or criminals, and distances them even further from the elite Christian audience of this letter. Jerome does seem to have some self-awareness. After this, he speaks about how noble it is to care for the sick and injured in this way, and that Fabiola could do that was something he praised. But he also acknowledges that many elites can't stand it. They throw the money in that direction and they let someone else take care of it. He doesn't blame these people at all. He says he pardons their squeamishness. And it might seem that this is somewhat compassionate, because he does say, you know, these are human beings and such. However, the reader is just told that the sick are human on some basic level and encouraged to contemplate that he might suffer some ills someday. It really rings hollow after we have this catalogue of disgusting things. But there is a parallel, and this is the last part of my paper, and there is a parallel in Gregory of Nyssa for the two lists of injuries and diseases. Gregory of Nyssa's homilies on loving the poor includes many descriptions and lists of disgusting things. But what you would see if you read the entire homilies on loving the poor is that this is treated with compassion, and people are encouraged to actually participate in healing and caring for the sick. He goes so far as to argue against fear of contagion, stating that many people devote their lives to sick people without getting sick themselves. So we see here kind of a parallel, not a parallel, but a contrast to what Jerome has done in his work. I mean, this is something compassionate, and Jerome is not. I suggest ultimately that Jerome's theological ideas about the holy poor and the vulgar poor, and the importance of choice for his brand of asceticism, have affected his perception of those suffering from bodily illness as well. So the indigent sick never chose to be that way. Their suffering is involuntary. They can't be viewed as a divine lesson in the same way that Lucilla's asceticism and fever can be. And the list of diseases in Epistle 66 is more normal. It doesn't have these criminal elements. So one finds the normal elements in Gregory of Nyssa, but the list in Epistle 77 is more sinister, and this letter is later. So I would suggest perhaps that there's an attempt in Epistle 77 to make the indigent sick more at fault for their own condition and justify the repulsion that Jerome himself feels. And this is my final slide, is that one finds some answer in the final part of this passage in Epistle 77, where he continues to talk about Fabiola, but says, you know, after we complete the part about sick people, she showed the same liberality towards the clergy, monks, and virgins. Was there any monastery that she didn't support? As if that were better than her work for sick people. So that's all I wanted to say today. Thank you very much.